In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2021. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. But the story behind that sentence began more than a decade earlier in Skidmore, Missouri. On a cold December morning in 2004, a pregnant woman named Bobby Jo Stinnett unlocked the door to her small house, expecting a visitor. They'd been chatting online about terriers. The woman, Lisa Montgomery, had driven 175 miles from Kansas, claiming she was there to see the puppies. But she came with something else in her coat pocket, a cord and a kitchen knife. Lisa spent 2 hours inside the house, and at some point, she attacked Bobby from behind and strangled her until she passed out. Then she took the knife and cut open her stomach. When Bobby came to, she fought back. Lisa strangled her again, harder this time, and finished what she came to do. She pulled the 8-month-old fetus from Bobby's body, cut the umbilical cord, cleaned the baby, and drove away. Bobby's mother found her hours later, bleeding on the floor, her stomach slashed open, and the baby gone. Lisa drove home and started showing off the child like it was hers. She told people she'd given birth while out shopping. The next morning, she took the baby to a diner with her family, smiling and showing her off to the waitress. But the lie didn't last. The FBI traced their online chats and arrived at her house the following day. When they asked about the baby, Lisa spun a story about a home birth. But that story didn't hold. She cracked under pressure and confessed. And when the DNA results came back, there was no doubt the baby was Bobby Jo's. This wasn't the first time Lisa had faked a pregnancy. She'd told her husband she was expecting multiple times, even though she'd been sterilized after her 4th child. So this time, she needed more than lies. She needed proof. Her ex was trying to take her kids away, and she thought a newborn in her arms might change everything. But her fantasy turned into murder. Prosecutors charged her with kidnapping resulting in death, a federal crime, and Lisa went to trial in 2007. Her lawyers claimed she suffered from severe mental illness, pseudopsoriasis, PTSD, and permanent brain damage from years of brutal sexual abuse by her family. But the jury didn't believe it. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Lisa spent 13 years on death row. When asked if she had any final words, she said, "No." Her last meal wasn't a feast or a special request, just a paper sack lunch, a chicken sandwich, a bag of chips, and a bottle of water. She was executed by lethal injection on January 13, 2021, in Indiana at 1:31 a.m. Lisa Marie Montgomery was 52 years old. Oof, that was just cruel, and that was only the beginning. Let's continue with the next execution scheduled just 1 day later. What did he do? The killings started in January 1992, and by the time February ended, 7 people were dead, all at the hands of Quintin Johnson. The motive, prosecutors said, was simple: power. Quintin was a key player in a violent cocaine trafficking crew operating in Richmond, Virginia, and anyone who posed a threat, real or imagined, was taken out. Some were shot, others were stabbed, all were disposable. Quintin Johnson was just 23 at the time, but federal prosecutors didn't see a kid. They painted him as cold, calculated, and ruthless, a man who used murder as a tool to protect and expand a drug empire built on fear. His story started in the chaos of New York City, where childhood was anything but safe. He was abused, neglected, and abandoned by his mother at 13. He bounced from one institution to the next, slipping through every crack in the system. By the time he ended up in Virginia, he could barely read or write. But none of that mattered on the street. The rules were simple: show loyalty, inspire fear, and survive. Over a span of 45 days, Quintin was involved in the killings of 7 people. Some were rivals in the drug trade, shot over territory and money. Others were caught in the crossfire, friends, family, or bystanders in the wrong place when Corey came knocking to collect a debt. And that was not it. His worst attack came when he suspected Linwood Childs of being a snitch. He opened fire, killing 2 men and injuring 2 women who barely survived. In 1993, Corey stood trial in federal court under a law targeting major drug traffickers. He was convicted on 7 counts of murder and sentenced to die. 2 of his co-defendants, Richard Tipton and James Rohn, were also convicted, both initially sentenced to death. Their cases dragged on for decades in federal appeals. But Corey's mental ability became a point of bitter legal debate. He had an IQ of 69 to 77, depending on the test, and scored in the bottom percentile in literacy. His team argued that he was intellectually disabled and that executing him would violate the Constitution, but the courts disagreed. By January 2021, the federal government was pushing through a wave of executions, racing the clock in the final days of the Trump administration. Corey Johnson was one of the names on that list. But just weeks before his scheduled execution, Corey tested positive for COVID-19. His lawyers pleaded for more time, warning that the virus had likely damaged his lungs. Lethal injection, they argued, wouldn't just stop his heart. It would feel like drowning. But the courts didn't stop it. The execution moved forward anyway. After spending 28 years on death row, Corey was strapped to the gurney at USP Terre Haute on the night of January 14, 2021. For his final meal, he requested a pizza and a strawberry milkshake. He had also requested jelly-filled donuts, but didn't receive them. In his last written words, he called the meal wonderful, but noted, "The donuts should be fixed." He declined to speak any final words. The drugs flowed at 11:30 p.m., and he was pronounced dead 4 minutes later. He was 52 years old. The death chamber didn't stay quiet for long. Just 24 hours later, another federal execution was already underway. But who was next, and what had he done to deserve the death penalty? On the night of January 27, 1996, Dustin Higgs drove to Washington, D.C. with Willis Haynes and another friend, Victor Gloria. They picked up 3 women along the way, Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishan Chin, and went back to Dustin's apartment in Maryland to hang out. At first, it seemed like just another late-night get-together. But something went wrong. An argument broke out, and tension quickly filled the room. Eventually, the women decided to leave, but Dustin and the others weren't about to let it end there. They followed the women in a van, and Dustin pulled over at the Patuxent Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. That's where, according to prosecutors, he turned to Willis and told him, "Make sure they're dead." Dustin stayed behind in the van while Willis walked the women into the dark woods. Gunshots followed, echoing through the trees. For nearly 3 years, no one had a clear answer to what happened. Then investigators named a suspect, Dustin Higgs. By that time, Dustin was already in prison on unrelated drug charges. He insisted he was innocent, said he never ordered anyone to kill, never pulled a trigger. And in 2012, Willis even signed a sworn affidavit stating that Dustin hadn't forced or threatened him to do anything that night. But it didn't matter. Dustin was sentenced to death in 2001 by a federal jury. Willis, the shooter, got life without parole. Victor, who testified for the government, served just 7 years. Dustin's legal team fought for decades. They argued that Dustin was convicted based on testimony from people who had every reason to lie. They pointed out that had the crime happened just a few hundred feet down the same road off federal land, Maryland would have tried him, and that state had already put an end to the death penalty. But nothing they said changed the outcome. Dustin spent 20 years on death row. On January 16, 2021, at 1:23 a.m., the U.S. government carried out its final execution under President Trump's first term. For his final meal, Dustin requested a pizza, a strawberry milkshake, and jelly-filled donuts. Later, he complained he didn't get his jelly-filled donuts. Yes, that's right, just like the previous federal inmate. Just before the drugs were pushed, Dustin used his last words to maintain his innocence. "I'd like to say I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders." He named each of the women who died that night. Dustin Higgs was executed by lethal injection at the age of 48. With the January executions completed, the next one was scheduled for May 19th. Let's take a look at what this death row inmate did. On September 11, 1999, 20-year-old Quintin Jones walked into a house where he had always been welcome. It belonged to his 83-year-old great-aunt, Berthena Bryant, the woman who had helped raise him. She had trusted him, loved him like a son, but that trust meant nothing that morning. Inside her Fort Worth home, Quintin picked up a baseball bat and beat her to death. Then he reached into her purse, took $30, money she might have given him, if only he had asked, and used it to buy cocaine. Soon after, Quintin confessed. He told police he was high on cocaine and heroin, barely aware of what he was doing. But this wasn't the only killing tied to his name. That same summer, 2 other men were murdered in separate incidents where Quintin was also involved. In those cases, he pointed the finger at another man, Ricky Russa, claiming Ricky was the one who pulled the trigger. Ricky, who is white, received life with the possibility of parole, and Quintin, who is black, was sentenced to death. He believed race played a role in the outcome. 2 men, similar crimes, but very different sentences. But that didn't matter anymore because his path to the execution chamber was set. At trial, he didn't fight the charges. He admitted what he'd done, and he showed real remorse. Even his family took the stand, speaking about the abuse he'd suffered as a child, neglect, assault by his siblings, and deep poverty. His mother had even threatened him with a gun once, and by his teens, he was already addicted to drugs. At one point, he even shot himself in the chest while trying to take his own life. Nonetheless, the jury sentenced him to death in 2001. He spent the next 20 years in solitary confinement, locked up 23 hours a day. But something changed behind those concrete walls. He started writing letters and read constantly. He began mentoring younger inmates, trying to steer them off the path he had taken. One of those letters reached Suleika Jawad, a writer who would go on to share his story in the New York Times. He never asked for pity, and he didn't expect forgiveness. But he told her one thing clearly. He was trying to leave something good behind. Berthena's sister, Maddie, forgave him, and so did Quintin's twin brother. Over 180,000 people signed petitions asking Texas Governor Greg Abbott to spare his life, but clemency never came. On May 19, 2021, at 6:40 p.m., Texas executed Quintin by lethal injection. Before the drugs took hold, Quintin gave his final words. "I would like to thank all of the supporting people who helped me over the years. To Mad Maddie, my twin Sonia, Angie, and all the homies, aka Money and Peruvian Queen, including Crazy Dominican. I was so glad to leave this world a better, more positive place. I hope I left everyone a plate of food full of happy memories, happiness, and no sadness. I'm done, Warden." Quintin wasn't allowed to choose a final meal. Texas ended that tradition in 2011 after inmates kept ordering enormous last meals and left them untouched. He was executed by lethal injection. Quintin Jones was 41 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On December 18, 2009, a quiet neighborhood in Kennedale, Texas, lit up in flames just after midnight. But what started as a house fire quickly turned into something far more horrific. When firefighters got inside, they found the burned bodies of Joy Hummel, her father Clyde, and her 5-year-old daughter Jody. All 3 had been brutally beaten to death before the fire was ever set, and Joy, she was pregnant. The scene was devastating, but one person was missing. John, Joy's husband and the father of her unborn child, wasn't in the house, and it took him until 4:30 a.m. to show up and speak with police, claiming he'd been out all night comparing prices for Christmas presents. But something was off. Officers spotted blood on his pants, scratches across his back, and later found more blood on his socks. He gave a statement, left the station, picked up his paycheck, and vanished. 2 days later, Border agents caught him trying to walk back into the U.S. from Tijuana without a passport. He was flagged as missing and possibly dangerous. Though no arrest warrant had been issued yet, agents held him until one came through. After being transferred to a San Diego jail, John confessed. He said he first stabbed and beat Joy and then attacked Clyde and Jody. He admitted setting the house on fire and driving to several Walmart stores afterward so he'd show up on security cameras. His clothes were covered in blood, and the murder weapons were later found in a dumpster. Investigators also learned about Christy Freeze, a woman John had been having an affair with while married to Joy. She said she broke off contact after discovering Joy was pregnant, but that John kept calling. Christy finalized her divorce just 2 days before the murders. After hearing all this, the jury didn't take long, and John was convicted of capital murder. They said he posed a continuing threat to society, and they didn't see any reason to spare his life. In 2011, he was sentenced to death. He spent 10 years on death row. On June 30, 2021, at the Huntsville unit, John wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal. He offered a short prayer on the gurney. "Yes, when they lay me down to sleep, for I am to die for justice, the Lord my soul to take. I'll be with Jesus when I wake," he said. Then addressed those present. "I truly regret killing my family," he said. "I am thankful for all the thoughts and prayers for my family over the last few days. I love each and every one of you." He was executed by lethal injection in Texas at 6:49 p.m. John Hummel was 45 years old. Oof, that was brutal. And while this execution in Texas had just ended, another death row inmate was already waiting until it was his turn. But what did he do? On September 13, 1991, less than 24 hours after walking free on parole, Rick Rhoades broke into a home in Pasadena, Texas. Inside were two brothers, 31-year-old Charles Allen and 33-year-old Bradley Allen. And what started as an argument on the front lawn turned into a bloodbath behind closed doors. Rick had been drinking, wandering through his old neighborhood when he crossed paths with Charles. According to him, Charles was going inside to grab a gun, and he followed him in. Inside the home, he grabbed a metal bar and beat Charles, then stabbed him with a kitchen knife during the struggle. When Bradley came to help his brother, Rick stabbed him too. When it was over, Rick changed into clean clothes, took some cash, and walked out, leaving two brothers bleeding on the floor behind him. Both men died from their injuries, and their bodies were discovered in the home not long after. Rick told police he only found out they died when he saw it on the news. But weeks later, during a failed school burglary, officers caught him. He said he was tired of running, and he confessed to the killings in disturbing detail. Back in 1992, a jury sentenced Rick to death for the double murder he committed. But even after the verdict, the fight was far from over. For years, Rick claimed his trial hadn't been fair. His attorneys argued that black jurors were wrongfully excluded, hinting at racial bias in the way the jury was selected. But the courts pushed back. By 2019, every appeal on that issue had been rejected. Still, Rick kept pushing, hoping for a new trial, a new outcome, anything. But the courts didn't budge. The date was set. He spent 28 years on death row. On his final day, September 28, 2021, Rick Rhoades didn't eat. He skipped both breakfast and lunch, and under Texas policy, he wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal. He spent his remaining hours quietly, speaking with his wife and a few close relatives. Then, when the moment came, he declined to say any last words. He lay still on the gurney as the drugs flowed into his veins. At 6:29 p.m., Rick Rhoades was executed by lethal injection in Texas. He was 57 years old. Just 1 week later, another execution was scheduled. But what did he do? And what did he choose for his final meal? Let's take a look. On February 12, 1994, in Columbia, Missouri, Ernest Johnson walked into a Casey's convenience store with one thing on his mind: getting money to buy more drugs. He was high on cocaine and carrying a borrowed pistol, but this wasn't going to be just a robbery. What happened next would go down as one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders in Boone County history. Ernest wasn't just looking for cash, he was ready to kill for it. Inside the store that night were 3 employees just trying to finish their shift: 46-year-old Mary Bratcher, 57-year-old Mabel Scruggs, and 58-year-old Fred Jones. But when Mary tried to destroy the safe key, hoping to protect the store's money, Ernest snapped. He pulled out a gun and shot all 3, then grabbed a claw hammer and kept going. And if that wasn't enough, he took a screwdriver and drove it into Mary's head, delivering the final blow. Afterward, he dragged their bodies into the bathroom and cooler, cleaned up what he could, and vanished into the night. He thought he'd gotten away with it, but it didn't take long, as police arrested him soon after. In court, the case was clear-cut. Prosecutors called it cold-blooded murder, and the jury didn't take long to agree. In May 1995, Ernest was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Years passed, and no date was set. Then, in 2008, Ernest underwent brain surgery to remove a tumor. Doctors later revealed the operation had removed up to 20% of his brain tissue, and afterward, he began suffering from seizures. His IQ had always tested low in the 60s and 70s, and his lawyers argued that he was intellectually disabled, not fit for execution. They even asked the state to use a firing squad instead of lethal injection, saying the drugs could trigger violent, painful seizures. But Missouri said no. The court ruled that Ernest was still eligible to die, and they moved forward with plans to carry out the sentence. By 2021, his case gained national attention. Lawmakers, church leaders, even Pope Francis pleaded with the governor to spare his life. Protesters stood outside courthouses, but none of it changed the outcome. On October 5, 2021, after spending 26 years on death row, Ernest was led into the execution chamber. For his last meal, he requested 2 bacon cheeseburgers, onion rings, 2 strawberry milkshakes, and a large pizza. Before the injection, he read a statement. "I am sorry and have remorse for what I do," he said. "I want to say that I love my family and friends. I am thankful for all that my lawyer has done for me. They made me feel love as if I was family to them." He continued, "I love them all. For all the people that has prayed for me, I thank them from the bottom of I love the Lord with all my heart and soul. If I am executed, I know where I am going. To heaven, because I ask Him to forgive me." He mouthed words to his family as the drugs entered his system. At 6:11 p.m., Ernest Lee Johnson was executed by lethal injection in Missouri. He was 61 years old. Just 16 days later, the next execution was scheduled. But what did he do? On October 27, 1991, in Birmingham, Alabama, 22-year-old Sharma Ruth Johnson pulled up to an ATM. It was just a regular stop until Willie Smith approached with a shotgun. He forced her into the trunk of her car at gunpoint, then used her bank card to withdraw $80. The entire time, Sharma was locked inside her own vehicle, terrified and powerless. But Willie didn't stop there. He drove her to a cemetery with others in the car, pulled her from the trunk, and shot her in the back of the head. Then he stuffed her body back inside, abandoned the car, and lit it on fire. Days later, her burned remains were found, still inside that trunk, alone and discarded like trash. He was arrested shortly after the murder, caught bragging about it to someone wearing a wire. And little did he know that every word he said became evidence against him. He was charged with capital murder and later convicted in court. The jury sentenced him to death. For 30 years, he remained on death row. Over the years, his lawyers argued he had an intellectual disability with IQ estimates ranging between 64 and 75. But courts ruled he was competent to face execution. His first execution date in February 2021 was halted just minutes before it began, after the Supreme Court agreed that Alabama couldn't proceed without allowing his personal pastor in the room. That decision put everything on hold, delaying the execution by 8 months. But then a new execution date was set, October 21st, 2021. And this time, when the moment came, the pastor stood by his side. Willie's final hours were quiet. He refused breakfast and lunch, snacked on chips during visitation, and spent his time with family, his wife, mother, stepfather, sister, brother-in-law, and his 2 nephews. He made no phone calls and offered no final words. At 9:30 p.m., the curtain opened. Pastor Robert Wiley placed a hand on Willie's leg and prayed. As the sedative midazolam flowed through his veins, Willie twitched twice. His breathing slowed, then stopped. The time of death was 9:47 p.m. He was 52 years old. And just 1 week later, the next execution was scheduled. Let's look at what this next death row inmate did. On November 13, 1998, inside the Dick Connor Correctional Center, 37-year-old John Grant was already serving a 130-year sentence for a string of armed robberies. He'd been locked up since he was 19. That morning, he got into another heated argument with prison cafeteria worker Gay Carter over something as small as a breakfast tray. But according to other inmates, this wasn't their first dispute. They heard him threaten her twice, once the day before and again that morning. Just minutes later, John was waiting in the shadows, standing near a supply closet inside the prison. And when Gay walked by, he grabbed her, dragged her inside, and stabbed her 16 times with a prison-made shank. One of the wounds tore through her aorta, and she bled out quickly. A correctional officer rushed to help, but it was too late. Afterward, John turned the blade on himself, trying to end his own life, but staff tackled him and pulled the weapon away before he could do more damage. Gay was taken to a hospital and pronounced dead soon after. In 2000, a jury convicted John of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. He spent 21 years on death row. His attorneys argued he was shaped by a brutal childhood, raised in poverty, abused, and shuffled through a broken juvenile system. But all clemency appeals were denied, and the courts upheld the sentence. His final request for mercy was rejected just 3 weeks before his execution. For his last meal, he ordered 2 bacon cheeseburgers, barbecue chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Pib Extra. Guards said he ate quickly, as if racing the clock. At 4 p.m. on October 28, 2021, Oklahoma resumed executions after a 6-year pause, and John became the first inmate to be executed under the state's updated protocol. But things didn't go smoothly. As soon as the sedative midazolam entered his system, witnesses saw his body convulse. He vomited repeatedly and gasped for air. His back arched off the gurney. Reporters described the scene as disturbing, more violent than any execution they'd seen before. A state-paid doctor disagreed, saying John was unconscious and didn't suffer. But the autopsy later revealed fluid-filled lungs and signs of drowning. The cause of death was listed as lethal injection, but what he felt before that, only John knew for sure. John Grant was 60 years old. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. David Neal Cox was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi on November 17, 2021. But what did he do? On May 14, 2010, in Sherman, Mississippi, 40-year-old Kim Cox was at her sister's home with her children and family, trying to stay safe from her estranged husband, David Neal Cox. 9 months earlier, David had been arrested for sexually abusing Kim's daughter, and he blamed Kim for turning their family against him. From jail, he threatened to kill her, and when he was granted bail, he followed through. He got to the house and quickly opened fire. In the chaos, Kim's sister and one of the boys managed to escape, running for their lives. But the others weren't so lucky. They were trapped inside, and for the next 8 hours, David held them hostage, armed, angry, and unpredictable. Then, in front of the children, he shot Kim in the stomach and raped his stepdaughter 3 times, while Kim bled out. He ignored every plea to let her get help. He wanted her to suffer. The standoff ended just after 3 a.m. when a SWAT team stormed the house and arrested him. David was charged with capital murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, burglary, and firing into a dwelling. In 2012, he pled guilty to all charges. The jury gave him the death penalty for Kim's murder and 185 years for the rest. He spent 9 years on death row. He later wrote to the judge saying he didn't regret killing Kim and would do it again. In 2021, a judge ruled he was mentally fit to waive his appeals. The state set an execution date. For his last meal, David requested fried catfish, French fries, cornmeal, and banana pudding. He shared it with the prison commissioner, 2 staff members, and 3 chaplains. When asked for his final words, David said, "I want my children to know that I love them very much and that I was a good man at one time. Don't ever read anything but the King James Bible." Before his death, David confessed to killing his sister-in-law, Felicia Cox, in 2007, 3 years before the crime for which he would be executed. David had always been the prime suspect, but there was never enough to prove it. That changed with his final words. Weeks after his execution, investigators followed his map, and they found Felicia's body, buried just where he said it would be. David Neal Cox was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi on November 17, 2021. He was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. He was 50 years old. And that brings us to the last death row inmate executed in 2021. It was the morning of January 24, 1985, a cold winter day in Oklahoma City. Linda Reeves, a 35-year-old schoolteacher, was spending time at the home of her boyfriend, Douglas Ivins. While Linda was asleep on the couch, Douglas answered the door to a familiar face, Bigler Stouffer, the man dating his estranged wife. Bigler claimed Velva, Douglas's ex, was in danger and needed a gun. Trusting him, Douglas handed over a .38 revolver. But just seconds later, the same gun was turned on him. Bigler shot Douglas 3 times. Then he walked over to Linda and fired 2 rounds into her head at point-blank range. Douglas survived, barely, while Linda died instantly. Prosecutors would later say Bigler had a motive. He wanted Douglas out of the picture so his girlfriend could collect a $2 million life insurance payout on her husband. A calculated plan, executed without mercy. But that plan backfired. Bigler was arrested the same day. At first, he denied everything, but eventually admitted to shooting Douglas. At trial, he claimed it was self-defense and said that Linda was already dead when he arrived. But the jury didn't believe him. In 1985, he was sentenced to death for murder and given life for attempted murder. He spent 36 years on death row. Bigler declined a special last meal. He was served the standard prison menu, 1 chicken burger, 2 slices of bread, chips, broccoli, fruit, 2 biscuits, a fruit drink, and water. Before the drugs were administered, he smiled, laughed softly, and said, "My request is that my father forgive them. Thank you." Bigler Stouffer was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on December 9, 2021. He was 79 years and 2 months old, making him the second oldest person ever executed in the state. That concludes all executions carried out in 2021. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.